There's a moment, and every species that has ever gone to war knows this moment, even if they refuse to name it, when you stop fighting for something and start fighting because of something. We thought we understood that distinction. We were helping them. That was the agreement, signed in 6 languages, sealed with the kind of diplomatic ceremony that makes everyone feel important and nobody feel honest. The Velthary compact would provide logistical support, medical relay stations, encrypted navigational corridors, and humanity would receive the benefit of 300 cycles of galactic infrastructure. A fair exchange, a civilized arrangement. Basically, we were assisting them. I want you to hold that word. Assisting. I want, I guess, you to feel the weight of it, the comfortable superiority baked into its syllables. To assist is basically to be above. To assist is to be generous. To assist is to look down at someone drowning and choose, from a position of safety, to extend your hand. We extended our hand. What we didn't understand, what none of us understood, not the Compact High Council, not the 17 allied species who signed the secondary accords, not even the humans themselves, I think, was what happens when the drowning person grabs your wrist. Not to be saved, and to pull you in, to show you what the water feels like. My name is Velka Sharif. I was a third-tier operational analyst for the Velthary Compact Humanitarian Reach Division. That title used to mean something. I used basically to sleep well. I used to believe that helping someone smaller than you was a form of power, and that power was a form of safety. I'm going to tell you what happened when humanity paid us back. I'm going to tell you what beyond belief actually looks like from inside the thing that can't believe it. I've been keeping a log. I timestamp everything. An old habit, a neurotic one. My former supervisor called it obsessive. She wasn't wrong. And so I can tell you exactly when each piece of my understanding broke. I won't spare myself in the telling. I was wrong about too many things to hide behind professionalism. This is the TBH account of Velka Sharif, HRD 3rd tier, timestamp beginning at 400.11 compact standard. This is what repayment looks like when the debt is owed by humans. The coffee, and I use that word loosely because what the humans brewed in the station's secondary galley bore the same relationship to actual coffee that a medical report bears to a living body. Smelled like burning insulation mixed with something organic and slightly furious. I've been informed by Corporal Adeyemi that this was the correct smell. That this was, in her words, how you know it's working. I noted the time. I noted the smell, which I added a small annotation to my log. Human beverage preparation, apparently adversarial in nature. That was day 1. I should explain the station. Mareth 7 wasn't a glamorous posting. It was a compact relay hub, one of 43 we maintain along the Kareth Expanse's contested outer edge, designed for exactly the kind of work the Humanitarian Reach Division specialized in: quiet, efficient, invisible support for species that hadn't yet achieved full galactic standing. The humans had achieved something approximating standing about 11 cycles prior, after the Velthary made first contact with their 3rd deep space colony mission. They were fast workers, humans. Faster pretty much than anyone had predicted, and the official HRD assessment, which I'd written a portion of myself, described them as an emergent species demonstrating accelerated technological adoption with moderate social stability indicators. What that meant in practice was they were getting places faster than we planned for, and our infrastructure wasn't quite keeping up with them, and the Compact had decided the most efficient solution was to bring them partially inside the system rather than keep watching them bump into its edges. TBH, hence Mareth 7, hence the joint posting, hence Corporal Adeyemi and her terrible coffee, and the way she looked at the station's Velthary standard lighting, tuned to our comfort spectrum, a gentle gold violet. That most species sort of found neutral, and said on her 2nd day, "Is there any chance we could get something brighter in here?" I keep thinking I'm about to fall asleep. The lighting, for reference, was operating at 340 lumens per square span. This was kind of standard, and this was the light level at which Velthary performed delicate surgical procedures. I noted the time. I noted the request, which I approved a temporary adjustment to 600 lumens in the human quarters and added an annotation. Human visual comfort threshold, really improved. Cross-reference with Homeworld star classification. Sol, G-type, luminosity 3846 x 10 exposant 6 watts. Note, they evolved under a very bright fire. That annotation was, I would later understand, the first correct thing I wrote about them. There were pretty much 6 humans on the initial rotation. Adeyemi was the senior enlisted, not the commanding officer. That was a woman named Lieutenant Vasquez who arrived on the second shuttle and immediately began rearranging the tactical display in the operations room before anyone had formally introduced themselves. Vasquez had the kind of face that suggested she had opinions about everything and shared most of them only after she'd already acted on them. She was shorter than I expected. Humans, I guess, are generally shorter than Velthari. We average about 2.3 spans. They cluster around 1.6 to 1.8. Vasquez seemed to compensate for this through a quality that I can only describe as density. Not physical density, to be fair, though she moved like something that weighed more than it appeared to. Presence density. The room changed when she entered it, which I didn't annotate this. Some observations resist timestamp. The arrangement was simple. Humans would provide 2 things. First-hand intelligence on movement patterns in the outer Kareth. They had 3 independent scouts running courier routes through the contested region, routes that predated the compact's mapping by several cycles, and what the HRD terms cultural liaison capacity, meaning that when compact representatives needed to interface with the 4 mid-development species in the expanse who had already made informal contact with human traders and diplomats, the humans would be present to smooth the translation. Not just linguistic translation, the other kind. In exchange, the compact provided Mareth 7's full infrastructure, medical capability that would have taken humanity 3 more generations to develop independently, FDL navigational data for the Kareth approach corridors that no human pilot had yet mapped. And this was the piece that mattered most to the HRD Senior Council, a formal protection covenant, meaning that if anyone pointed weapons at human assets in the expanse, the compact's considerable diplomatic weight would point back. It was a good deal. For them. We had done this before, you understand. 47 times with 47 emerging species, and the compact had a well-worn groove for it. You come in, you provide the infrastructure, you let them feel the warmth of something larger than themselves, and gradually, over decades, sometimes centuries, they integrate. They become part of the system. The system absorbs them. Everyone benefits, and no one notices when the balance of contribution quietly, permanently tips toward the ones who were there first. I'm not TBH describing something sinister. This is simply how large systems work. Gravity doesn't apologize for the way it shapes smaller bodies. I kind of annotated none of this. It was doctrine. Doctrine doesn't need timestamps. For what it's worth, 714.22. Ops Room, Mareth 7. The first time I understood that something about this posting was going to be different wasn't dramatic. There pretty much was no flash of insight, no moment where I looked at Vasquez and thought, this one is going to change something. That isn't how understanding actually arrives. It arrives the way a slow leak in a pressure seal arrives. You notice small wrongnesses for a long time before you notice that the room has changed temperature. The small wrongness was this. Vasquez had been in the ops room for 6 hours. It was her 3rd day on station. She had spent the first day rearranging the tactical display. She had spent the second day, I had the timestamps, reading every piece of publicly available compact documentation on the Kareth Expanse's political geography, something that typically occupied new liaison officers for 3 to 4 standard weeks. She had, I guess, apparently done this while also eating because there was a container of something that smelled like fermented grain and preserved vegetables sitting on the edge of the display console, and it was empty by the time I came in at 0700. On the 3rd day, she called me in and pointed at the display and said, "Who's running the Ordhani?" I should explain the Ordhani. They were one of the 4 mid-development species in the expanse, roughly where humanity had been about 60 cycles prior, which is to say capable of interstellar travel, but not yet capable of the political architecture required to use it without causing several consecutive crises. They had been a compact diplomatic concern for 20 cycles. Managing their territorial anxieties was delicate work that the HRD's senior expanse officers had been carefully, methodically pursuing for nearly a decade. The light compacts Ordhani desk, I said. Senior diplomat actually, Rin Valeth leads the engagement team. It is a long-term, they're not responding to long-term, Vasquez said. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the display, where the Ordhani territorial boundaries were marked in their standard pale orange. They've been escalating border challenges in the outer corridor for 6 weeks. That's not a political process. That's a stress response. I looked at the display. The border challenges were noted. They, were within the expected variance range for Orthani diplomatic positioning. The HRD had calculated the probability of actual hostile engagement at 11.3%, which was low enough to qualify as monitoring non-priority. The compact's assessment. I know the compact's assessment. She picked up the empty container from the console, looked into it, appeared mildly disappointed to find it empty. I read it. It was, written 8 months ago, before the HFY consortium started running supply ships through the outer corridor. I stopped. The HFY consortium is a mid-tier commercial entity operating in the outer expanse. They were not, to be fair, in the Orthani desk's risk calculus. They were not in any risk calculus I was aware of. They moved cargo. They were pretty much noted in the station's commercial traffic log as a routine throughput entity. What does the consortium have to do with the Orthani are resource anxious? Their third largest mineral extraction operation is in the outer corridor, and the consortium's shipping lanes pass within 40,000 spans of it. The consortium's been increasing throughput for 3 months. To the Orthani, that looks like a competing territorial claim getting louder. She set the empty container down. They're, I think, not escalating at the compact. They're escalating past the compact at the thing they think the compact can't see. The compact's Orthani desk had 11 senior diplomats. They had been working the engagement for 20 cycles. Vasquez had been on station for 3 days. I noted the time. I wrote nothing else in the log for several minutes, which was unusual for me. The gap in my timestamps, 714.22 to 719.07, is, in retrospect, the sound of my first assumption cracking. 800.55, for what it's worth, secondary galley. You want some? Adeyemi was holding a mug in my direction. The coffee smell hit me before I could formulate a response. I'm not certain that substance is calibrated for Velthary. It's not calibrated for anyone, she said cheerfully. That's sort of the point. She poured herself a mug, looked at it with what I'd begun to recognize as genuine affection, and took a long drink. Her face actually did something complex, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a brief tension in the jaw muscles that I'd seen her make before and could not confidently classify. It wasn't pain. It wasn't pleasure. It was something that existed in the space between them, and humans seemed to seek it deliberately. I noted the time. I annotated. Human relationship to discomfort. Inverted from expected aversion model. Investigate further. She's good, Adeyemi said, in the tone that meant she was talking about Vasquez without wanting to make it formal. The lieutenant appears to have a facility for pattern analysis, I said carefully. Adeyemi smiled, pretty much. Human smile with their teeth, which, I should be honest, is something I've been warned about in the HRD orientation materials. The materials describe the human smile as a non-threatening social signal that may appear alarming due to the visibility of dentition. This was technically accurate. It was also deeply insufficient as a description. Adeyemi's smile wasn't alarming. It was the opposite of alarming. It was the kind of thing that made you want to be included in whatever she found amusing about the universe. She's good, Adeyemi said again, and drank her coffee and didn't elaborate. Humans do that. They say a thing twice when they mean a third thing entirely, and they trust you to cross the distance yourself. It took me about 2 weeks to understand this. It took me basically another 3 to stop annotating it as incomplete communication and start understanding it as a different kind of completeness. Look, 1102.30. Operations room. Vasquez's assessment of the Orthani situation turned out to be correct. This I learned 11 days later when the Compact's Orthani desk sent an urgent priority flag reporting that a border challenge had escalated to a formal territorial declaration, the Orthani equivalent of a warning shot across the bow of a star system, and requesting emergency diplomatic resources. Vasquez, had already drafted a response protocol. She handed it to me without comment when the flag came in. 7 pages, and she had written it 4 days earlier. I transmitted it to the HRD Senior Counsel with my endorsement. This was the first time I'd endorsed a non-compact document in 6 cycles of service. I noted the time. I noted my, own action, which felt strange, like recording yourself breathing. The council accepted the protocol with minor modifications. Rinvalatha's team set up it, and the territorial declaration was walked back within 3 days. I should have paid more attention to what I was learning. The evidence was clear. I was watching, I think, it, and annotating it, and filing it correctly, and still somehow not seeing it whole. The way you can read every individual word of a sentence and miss the meaning of the sentence entirely. The compact had been assisting humanity for 11 cycles. Vasquez had been on my station for 11 days. These two facts were sitting in my log, side by side, time-stamped accurately, and I wasn't yet asking the right question about them. 1345.17. Which equipment bay? Lower deck. I found Adeyemi there because she was the one who kept the station's secondary mechanical systems running, and the secondary mechanical systems had developed a problem. Specifically, the atmospheric recycler for the human quarters had begun producing air that smelled, according to Adeyemi, who had knocked on my office door with an expression of profound restraint, like a gym locker full of old socks. I didn't know what a gym locker was. Ami noted the time and added, investigate. She was kind of on her back under the recycler housing with a tool in each hand and a third tool held in her teeth, which is the kind of thing that shouldn't have worked but apparently did. The Veltri standard repair protocol for recycler maintenance involved 2 technicians, specialized calibration equipment, and between 4 and 6 hours of work. Adeyemi had been in there for 20 minutes. Hand me the flat one, she said from under the housing. I looked at the tools laid out beside her, 7 of them, 3 of which appear to be Veltri issue, and 4 of which appear to be human-made and definitely not part of the station's official equipment manifest. I selected what I believed to be the flat one. Other flat one. I selected the other flat one. There was a series of sounds, mechanical, some of them language that I suspected wasn't standard, and then a clunk, and then a hiss, and then Adeyemi came out from under the housing covered in a fine gray dust that was definitely atmospheric filter residue, and definitely not supposed to be that color. She looked at the tool in her hand. She looked, I think, at the recycler housing, which she put the tool in her teeth, picked up a different one, went back under. The protocol for this repair, I began. Takes 6 hours, she said, muffled. I know. I read the protocol. A pause. Another clunk. Plus, I did it different. Different how? Bypassed the calibration sequence. The machine doesn't need to know the exact filter density. It just needs the airflow to be not blocked. The calibration is for optimization. Right now, we need functional. She came back out, stood up, turned the recycler on. It ran. Plus, it sounded slightly rougher than the calibration sequence would have produced, and I would have in this, but the air from the vent was already different, cleaner, cooler, absent of whatever gym locker meant. Adeyemi took a long breath of it with a specific expression I was beginning to recognize as satisfaction. Good enough, she said. I noted the time. I wrote, human technical approach, functional adequacy over optimal specification. I guess outcome, equivalent. Time cost, 85% reduction. Then I looked for what it's worth at what I'd written. I looked at it for a long time. The compact had built this station, had designed every system in it to precise specification, had written protocols that produced correct results through thorough processes. And what Adeyemi had just done was read our protocol, understand it completely, identify the part that was strictly necessary, discard the rest, and reach the same destination in a fifth of the time. She hadn't done it to be impressive. She had done it because the air smelled bad and she had better things to do. You do this often? I asked. Modify the repair procedures. She thought about it. Modify everything, eventually, she said. You learn how, basically, something works, you figure out what it actually needs. They're not always the same. She said it the way you describe a preference for tea over coffee. Conversationally, offhandedly, without any awareness that she had just articulated a philosophy that had, in 11 days, been applied to my station's mechanical systems, my senior counsel's diplomatic intelligence gap, and at least 2 other problems that I was still compiling. I, for what it's worth, went back to my office. I opened my log. I sat for a long time without typing. The compact had been assisting humanity for 11 cycles. I was, for the first time, considering the possibility that we had been measuring the wrong direction. Actually, 2203.44. Personal quarters, Mareth 7. I don't, in my opinion, sleep well on stations. My annotation logs always get longer in the dark hours. I go back and revise things, add observations I missed, argue with my own earlier conclusions. It is a habit my former supervisor described as compulsive, and my current situation was doing nothing to improve. I was reviewing the Orhani file when my door chimed. It was Vasquez, and she was holding a mug. Not the coffee. Something different, something that smelled dark and warm and faintly of something I later learned was called cardamom. "You're logging," she said. It wasn't a question. The light from my display was visible under the door, apparently. I timestamp extensively. I noticed. She didn't come in. She stood in the doorway, which was slightly too short for standard Veltri clearance, and she didn't seem to notice. "You've been staring at the Orhani file for 2 hours. How did you, Station Network? The file access log is visible to senior staff." She shrugged. A human gesture I'd cataloged, but still found unexpectedly eloquent. A whole sentence in a single shoulder movement. Not snooping, just thorough. "You're trying to figure out if I got lucky." I said nothing. "I didn't," she said. "But I also didn't do anything special. I just read what was there." She looked at the mug in her hand, then held it out toward me. "It's not the coffee. It's less violent." I took it. The smell was different, more complex, not adversarial, and "Your compact has good infrastructure," she said. "The data systems are clean, the documentation is thorough. You built the right tools." She looked at me steadily. "You just stopped reading them at some point. Started managing the process instead." I didn't annotate this conversation for 3 days. Some observations need time to become true. When I finally logged it, I wrote, "Lieutenant Vasquez, 400.11 to 2203.44. Day 3 of joint posting. Plus, total sleep logged, 4.2 hours. Volume of station documentation reviewed. Complete. Number of errors and compacts active assessments identified. At minimum, 1 confirmed, 2 suspected." Then, I wrote, "We gave them infrastructure. They gave it back to us improved. I'm not certain this was in the agreement." Then I closed the log and sat in the dark and drank the cardamom thing and thought about what you call it when the person you were helping starts helping you back, and you realize you can't quite tell anymore who needed help to begin with. I didn't have a word for it. That, I would later understand, was the first human thing that happened to me. The alert came in at a time that I will always associate with a specific quality of silence. The deep, pressurized silence of a station at minimum crew, when the systems hum lower and the lights drop to maintenance level, and the only sounds are the recyclers and the distant structural ticks of metal adjusting to thermal gradients. The kind of silence you trust, and I've been asleep for almost 2 hours, which was above my recent average. The alert, was priority 3. Not the worst. Not the kind that bypasses the duty officer and screams directly into your personal comm. That is priority look 1, and I'd experienced 2 of those in my career, and the memory of both still affects my timestamps. Priority 3 meant a situation is developing, the duty officer has assessed it, your awareness is requested. The duty TBH officer was Corporal Nwosu, the second human on Adeyemi's team, a tall, quiet man who documented everything in handwriting on actual physical paper, which I'd found baffling until Adeyemi explained that he simply thought better with a pen and that this was nobody's business but his own. He met me in the ops room with his paper notebook open and a look on his face that I'd not seen before. "Survey drone Mareth, 7, Kappa, 6 is down," he said. The survey drones were the station's eyes in the outer corridor, automated probes that swept the expanse's edge and fed navigation and traffic data back to the relay hub. We had 11 of them. Losing one wasn't a crisis. Kind of drones failed. Retrieval protocol, already I guess, ran it. Drones not malfunctioning. Plus it stopped. He turned his Tebuk toward me. His handwriting was very neat and slightly cramped, as if he was always aware of how much page he had left. It stopped at these coordinates, and it's not sending error codes. It's sending a single repeating signal on an unregistered frequency. I looked at the coordinates. Outer corridor, near the Orhani boundary. I looked at the frequency, unregistered but not random. It had a structure, a rhythmic quality. "That's a contact signal," I said. "Yes. Not from us. Not look from the Orhani. We had their communication signatures on file, and this matched none of them. Not from any registered entity operating in the expanse." "Get Vasquez," I said. She's already here, said Vasquez from the doorway. She was holding the coffee. I didn't have time to note the time. I did it from memory. Later, 311.14. She had arrived 6 minutes after the alert. She had kind of come in with her coffee already made, which meant she had been awake. I didn't ask. I was learning not to ask questions whose answers I wasn't ready for. The signal was, Vasquez determined in approximately 25 minutes, a distress marker. Not compact standard, not any standard I recognized, but the structure, the repetition interval, the frequency over time modulation, matched a distress pattern that humanity had developed independently before first contact, back when they were broadcasting into a void they didn't know was occupied. How do you know this pattern? I asked. Because we built it, she said, and we sent it out for 40 years before anyone answered. She wasn't looking at me. She was working the display, pulling the drone's last visual data. Whoever is kind of sending this either has contact with Earth, or they independently converged on the same solution. A pause, which means they're in trouble, and they've been trying to get someone's attention for a while. The Orthani situation is separate. This is coming from further out, past the boundary, into unregistered space. She turned to look at me then, and her expression was not alarmed. It was something more considered than alarm. Basically, alarm is reactive. This was deliberate. Plus, someone is out there, and they've been broadcasting for long enough that the signal has degraded into drone-readable range. Compact protocol for unregistered distress in non-sovereign space is investigation and assessment prior to engagement. She said it precisely, the way you repeat a thing you have memorized to argue with it. I know. I need to log this formally before we can, I know. She picked up her coffee. She drank it. The adversarial smell. The complex TBH, face, not pain, not pleasure, the thing between them. Log it. I'll have the assessment ready before you're done. She was right that she would. I'd stopped finding to be fair, this surprising somewhere around day 12, which I noted with mild concern about my own adaptability thresholds. Vasquez's assessment was, 9 pages. I read it in the time it took Nwosu to complete the formal log entry. Brew a second iteration of whatever creature the coffee had become at this hour. The entity sending the signal was based on drone visual data analysis, a small craft. Not compact TBH, design, not any design in the registry. It was sitting approximately 8,000 spans past the Orthani boundary, in a region of the expanse that the compact survey data marked as geologically unstable, a polite way of saying that the local asteroid density made navigation without current data genuinely dangerous. The craft had, based on Vasquez's analysis of its ion trail and current drift trajectory, been stationary for approximately 18 standard days. They're not transmitting on their own power, she said, when I reached that section. The signal is running on emergency battery. Main drive is look cold. How long do emergency batteries? I stopped, looked at the specs. They've, to be fair, been on emergency power for 18 days. At least. Could be longer if they were conservative about what they kept running. I stared at this. 18 days in a drifting, powerless craft in an asteroid-dense, unregistered zone, broadcasting a distress signal into a frequency nobody monitored. What species? I asked. Can't tell from the exterior. But the signal pattern, she tapped the relevant page. The interval between pulses is 1.618 cycles. Recurring. I wasn't immediately familiar with that number's significance. Vasquez saw my expression. It's a mathematical ratio, she said. Plus, specific one. It shows up honestly in organic growth patterns, spirals in shells, branching in plants, proportions in certain body structures. Lots of species independently discover it, which when you want to signal intelligence to someone who doesn't know your language, you use math. A pause. We did the same thing. Our first deep space broadcast included it. You recognize the pattern? Yeah. Because you used it? Yeah. I wrote, in my log, a single annotation. They've been where this ship is. They know what it feels like to broadcast into silence and hope. I didn't read this annotation back to myself for several days. When I did, I understood it differently. The compact protocol required assessment prior to engagement. Assessment required a minimum 6-hour evaluation period. The evaluation period existed to prevent hasty diplomatic commitments in ambiguous zones. The craft, based well on battery decay estimates, had approximately 30 hours of life support remaining. I completed the formal assessment in 4 hours and 22 minutes, which was a personal record, and require me to skip 2 documentation sub-protocols that I would need to retroactively complete. I noted the time I decided to skip them. The gap between, in my opinion, those 2 timestamps was 7 seconds, which was, I acknowledge, fast for me. The authorization for engagement came through at 623.15. Vasquez had already prepped the station's courier ship. It was a small craft built for fast navigation, technically rated for a crew of 2. She had put Adeyemi in the pilot's seat and was standing at the bay door in an EVA suit that had been modified. I noticed this, annotated it automatically, with several additions that were not standard compact issue. In my opinion, extra tether points. Plus, a secondary tool harness. Something secured to her left forearm that looked like a modified cutting torch reconfigured into something smaller and probably more versatile. Protocol requires a pretty much compact observer on any first contact engagement, I said. She looked at me. The EVA helmet was under her arm. Her expression wasn't impatient. Plus, it, I think, was somehow expectant. You have a suit? She asked. I did. Every station officer did. Plus, I'd worn mine twice in 6 cycles of service. Once for a drill, once for an actual hull microfracture that had resolved without incident before I finished suiting up. Get it, she said, and turned back to the bay. I noted the time, and I noted that I was about to do something outside my operational parameters. I didn't note any hesitation because I didn't find any, which was itself something I should haven't and didn't. The asteroid kind of field wasn't what the geological survey had described. Geological surveys, I was discovering, had a way of being accurate about the facts and completely wrong about the experience of those facts. Yes, there were asteroids. Yes, they were densely distributed. The survey had expressed this in numerical density per cubic span, and that number had seemed manageable when I read it on a display. Being inside, it was different. Adeyemi flew the courier ship the way she had fixed the recycler, functional over optimal, moving through gaps that the navigation computer kept flagging as non-recommended. That she kept taking anyway, because the non-recommended gap was there, and the recommended route added 4 minutes, and for minutes wasn't available. I was watching the navigation computer's hazard assessment update in real time. I noted the timestamps. The assessments were revising upward on a fairly aggressive curve. Is this? I began. Plus, it's fine, Adeyemi said. The computer is calculating based on mean object velocity. These rocks are slower than average in this zone, probably because of the gravity gradient from that mass over there. She gestured without looking. A rock the size of a Valkyrie cargo bay was moving in a slow, predictable arc approximately 200 spans off our port side. I'm reading the pretty much actual movement, not the statistical model. I looked at the rock. I looked at Adeyemi's hands on the controls. Loose, responsive, not the white-knuckled grip the situation seemed to my assessment to warrant. She was making constant, small corrections, a continuous fluid adjustment, the way a Valkyrie would adjust their hearing to a complex sound environment. Not fighting the field, reading it. How do you know which model to use? I asked. You watch long enough, she said. You see the pattern under the pattern. I wrote this down. I wasn't certain why. Plus, it seemed like the kind of sentence that needed to exist somewhere in writing. The ship was smaller than I expected from the drone footage. Maybe 11 spans in length, irregular in shape. Not designed irregular, damage irregular. Something had happened to it. The aft section showed the kind of structural deformation that happens when a drive system fails under load. The hull was dark. I think no running lights. No navigation beacons. The emergency transmitter was a small unit mounted on the exterior, exposed, bolted to the hull with what appeared to be. I confirmed this through the optics, 3 different types of fasteners, 2 of which didn't match the hull material. They mounted, it themselves, Vasquez said from the seat beside me. After the drive failed. Plus, pretty much went outside and attached a transmitter to the hull with whatever they had. In an asteroid field, I looked at the mismatched fasteners on the little transmitter, doing their quiet, determined job of holding a signal into the void for 18 days and more. There was something about them, The three different types, the obvious improvisation, the sheer specificity of the problem they had solved, that was difficult to look at for reasons I could not immediately categorize. Adeyemi matched, I think, velocity with the drifting craft and held position 40 spans off while Vasquez went EVA. I watch her TBH on the suit camera feed. She moved along, pretty much, the hull of the other ship slowly, methodically, checking surfaces with her hands as much as her eyes. When she found the airlock, she paused, examined the exterior control panel, dark, no power, and then did something with the tool on her forearm that I couldn't follow precisely, and the lock cycled manually. I think she went inside. For 6 minutes and 40 seconds, I have the timestamps. There was only the sound of her breathing on the suit feed. Then, 2 aboard. Both alive. Plus, one is in bad shape. A pause, the kind that carries calculation in it. They're not a species I've seen documented. Another pause. They're scared, hiding in the back. Her voice went quieter, not to me, to them. Hey, and I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here because your signal worked. Silence on the feed. A long silence. Then, a sound I didn't recognize. Not language. Something that might have been language and might have been a response to tone rather than words. Yeah, Vasquez said. Yeah, I know. You've been here a while. The quietness in her voice was the same quality as when she had handed me the cardamom drink in the doorway. Not soft exactly, but placed, deliberate. Plus, you're okay now. I noted the time, 909.52. I wrote nothing else for 4 minutes. The 2 sort of occupants of the derelict craft were aboard. The one in bad shape was in the courier's small medical bay, where Adeyemi was working with the kind of focused economy she brought to all repairs, functional before optimal. The other was in the rear compartment, wrapped in a thermal layer that had been Vasquez's, though Vasquez hadn't made any announcement about this, and appeared not to notice that she was now slightly cold. I think the species was unregistered. I'd searched the compact database during transit and found nothing matching their physical description. Bilateral symmetry, 6 limbs, photoreceptors on articulating stalks. Nothing. No documentación. In my opinion, no prior contact record. No species classification. They actually had been in an asteroid field for more than 18 days on battery power in a damaged craft, and the compact, which had been mapping and cataloging the expanse for 300 cycles, had no record of them. I thought about this for a long time. The compact's reach was extensive. Our documentation was thorough. Our survey drones covered, we believed, comprehensive grid patterns. Vasquez's assessment had identified this craft because she had looked at a drone's unscheduled stop and asked why, where a routine review would have logged it as a malfunction and moved on. How many others? I asked her quietly. Do you think the drones stop at and we log as malfunction? She didn't answer immediately. She was looking, well, at the wrapped figure in the rear compartment. I've been wondering that since the signal analysis, she said. The compact has survey infrastructure covering. You have infrastructure that covers what you've already decided is there. She said it without judgment. That was the thing about Vasquez. She said difficult things as plainly as she said simple ones, and she never seemed to expect you to argue back because she was never saying them to win an argument. She was saying them because they were true, and she'd looked at them long enough to be sure. Good infrastructure, accurate data, and you just drew the search grid around what you expected to find. The unregistered species in the rear compartment shifted under its thermal layer. One of the photoreceptor stalks turned toward the viewport, toward the stars. Which, what do we do with them? I asked. We take them home, she said, as if this were the only possible answer, as if the entire question of what to do with a lost, undocumented species in need of medical attention had exactly one solution that any functional civilization would arrive at without discussion. I noted the time. I added an annotation that I rewrote 3 times before I settled on the final version. Human default when encountering an unknown, not assessment. Pretty much, not documentation. Not classification. What the human says is, take them home. The compact, will require 6 weeks of formal evaluation before we can even assign a species designation. Vasquez answered the question in 4 words while she was still cold from giving away her thermal layer. I'm beginning to think the infrastructure was always in service of the wrong instinct. The worse off of the 2, the one Adeyemi had been working on, was stable by the time we docked. Stable in the sense that the immediate crisis had been interrupted. Not solved. The medical bay's equipment wasn't calibrated for an unregistered species, because you can't calibrate equipment for a species whose biology is unrecorded. Adeyemi had been working the problem for 6 hours. I looked in on her twice. The second time, she had pulled the medical bay's diagnostic equipment entirely apart and reassembled it in a configuration that wasn't in any manual I'd access to, and she was running in a mode that wasn't any mode I recognized. And when I asked, she said, without looking up, standard setup reads 12 biological parameters. This one wasn't matching any of them. I opened it up, and there are 16 sensors. The other 4 just turned off by default because the compact standard patients don't need them. This one does. The medical equipment had 4 additional sensors that were turned off. The documentation didn't mention them. How did you know they were there? I asked. Took it apart, she said. If something's built to do a job, it usually does more than the instructions say. You have to look at what it can do, not just what it's set to do. She said this while reassembling a medical scanner designed by the Vel3 Compact's most advanced bioengineering division, which she had taken apart and reconstructed in approximately 4 hours to serve a function it was never formally intended to serve, in order to save a life that the Compact's official assessment criteria hadn't yet decided how to classify. I left her to it. I went to my office and I opened my log. I wrote, honestly, day 34, the Compact's tools as modified by Adeyemi are performing functions their designers didn't document. The Compact's survey grid, as reviewed by Vasquez, missed a contact that has been broadcasting for longer than my last 2 postings combined. The Compact's assistance agreement with humanity, as I understood it on day 1, was a transfer of resources and knowledge from a more developed civilization to a less developed one. I paused. I've been here 34 days, and I'm no longer certain who was learning from whom. I'm not certain this was ever the direction it appeared to be. I'm not certain the Compact's infrastructure was ever as comprehensive as we believed it was. I'm quite certain now that the humans have known this, diplomatically, tactically, intuitively, since roughly day 3. I looked at the empty mug on my desk. Look, cardamom. She had given it to me on day 3. I've been sitting in the dark trying to figure out whether Vasquez had gotten lucky, and she had brought me a drink that was complex and warm and not adversarial, and she had stood in a doorway that was too short for her and not noticed, and she had said, you stopped reading them. Started managing the process instead. I've been managing the process of recording what I witnessed without understanding what I was witnessing. 34 days. Plus, I timestamp everything. I was only now beginning to understand what the timestamps meant. The unregistered species, who we were calling the Mivith because that was the closest phonetic rendering of what they called themselves, and because calling them Subject 1 and Subject 2 was a practice that Adeyemi had ended on day 2 with a single look that I chose not to formally annotate, had been on the station for 27 days. The worse off one, who had a constellation of injuries that Adeyemi had treated using equipment she had modified and protocol she had largely invented, was now walking the corridors. Slowly but walking. The Compact's official response to the discovery of an unregistered species was still in the evaluation phase. I'd submitted the contact report on day 34. I'd followed sort of up on day 40. On day 50, I'd transmitted a priority flag. As of day 61, I'd a formal acknowledgement of receipt and a notification that the Species Classification Committee was in session. The Mivith were in my station, eating food that Adeyemi had spent 3 days adapting from the galley's raw stock after determining their dietary requirements through a combination of careful observation, cautious testing. What she described as a lot of guessing. They were sleeping in quarters that Nwosu had quietly reconfigured, adding extra thermal layers and adjusting the light spectrum after noting that the Mivith photoreceptors seemed to prefer a narrower frequency range. Nobody had formally authorized this. Nobody had formally unauthorized it either. The documentation gap was something I was managing on a rolling basis and preferred not to examine too closely. What I was examining at 220.44 was a report from the outer corridor. A different kind of report. The report was from one of the human courier runners, not our station crew, but the independent operators who worked the outer expanse routes. A man named Ferreira, whose file I'd reviewed when he first appeared on the station's commercial traffic log 6 weeks ago. His route took him along the boundary between registered and unregistered space, and he moved things, cargo, data packages, occasionally people, with an efficiency that the Compact's commercial assessors had flagged as exceeding standard projection in ways they hadn't fully explained. His report, submitted at 208.55, was brief even by human standards. It said, seeing Kethvar military movement in the unregistered zone. Not survey which formation patterns, group transit, minimal broadcast signature. They're trying to move quiet. 3 days out from the Ordhani boundary. Thought you should know. I guess, F the Kethvar. I'm going to take a moment with this name because it deserves one, and because my reaction to reading it in that report, the specific quality of alertness that registered in my system, the way my annotation reflex fired 3 times in a second on the same timestamp, is itself information. The Kethvar were not a benign presence in the expanse. They were a military sovereign entity, no other way to describe them, who operated on a doctrine that the Compact's political assessors summarized as territorial maximalism with suppressed broadcast signature, which meant they claimed space by moving into it, and they didn't announce that they were doing so. By the time you knew the Kethvar were somewhere, they had already decided it was theirs. The Compact had 3 formal diplomatic disputes with the Kethvar dating back to the last century. None resolved, and 3 days out from the Ordhani boundary meant 3 days out from the edge of Compact adjacent space. The unregistered zone where the Mivitha's derelict ship had been drifting was also in the unregistered zone. I noted the time 3 times in a row. That isn't procedurally standard, which I noted that I wasn't-ing it, and stopped. Vasquez read Ferreira's report in approximately 4 minutes. She read it without expression I could identify, which I'd learned wasn't the same as having no expression. The humans' faces were more complex than I'd initially cataloged. Not more emotional, exactly, but more layered. Vasquez's neutral face was a face doing a great deal of internal work that it declined to share. The Kethvar don't enter unregistered zones by accident, she said. No, and they don't move in formation patterns unless they're approaching a target. She looked at me. What's in the unregistered zone that would be worth targeting? I didn't say the Mivith. I was thinking the Mivith. Plus, you're thinking the Mivith, she said. The possibility that derelict craft is still out there. Transmitter's still active, probably. Adeyemi said the battery would last another 3 weeks. If to be fair, Kethvar are scanning the zone, they'd pick it up. She moved to the display. And I guess if there are 2 Mivith, there are more Mivith. If there are more Mivith, there's a Mivith home system. If there's actually a home system, a new territorial target, I said. Or a population they already have a claim on. She said it carefully, the way you say something that you have considered from multiple angles and found distressing from all of them. Either way, they're not entering the zone to introduce themselves. I processed this. The Compact protocol for Kethvar military movement in boundary-adjacent space was document, report, request senior council guidance, await response within 10 standard days. 10 days, I said before I'd meant to say anything. Yeah, Vasquez said, and the Kethvar will reach the Ordhani boundary in 3. Yeah. I looked at the display, at the movement patterns Ferreira had described. He had included rough coordinate estimates, the kind that come from a courier pilot doing mental math on a moving ship. Not precise, but directional. Directional toward the unregistered zone. Directional toward the, in my opinion, zone where 27 days ago, 2 members of an undocumented species had been slowly dying on battery power. Vasquez was already pulling up communication logs. Not the Compact formal channels. The human courier network. The informal web of independent operators running the outer expanse routes, sharing information in short, blunt messages with zero protocol overhead. How many people does Ferreira know on these routes? I asked. Every single one, she said. That's the point. What happened next is difficult to log precisely because it didn't happen in the orderly sequential fashion that logs are designed to capture. It happened the way a problem gets solved by humans in general, which is to say, in parallel with inconsistent information flow, with several moments where I could not determine who was making decisions and who was implementing them and whether those are different people. Vasquez sent, to be fair, 12 messages in 40 minutes. Not through, the Compact relay system, through the courier network's shared channel, a communication infrastructure that the Compact technically knew about and informally tolerated because it improved commercial reliability in the outer routes. I guess the messages were short. They were specific. They look contained information about Kethvar movement or Orthani boundary proximity, and something I didn't initially understand, which was coordinates. A set of coordinates in the unregistered zone past the Orthani boundary in the asteroid field. Coordinates of the Mivith derelict. Why are you broadcasting the location of a potentially vulnerable? I'm not broadcasting, she said. I'm sharing it with 8 specific people on routes that pass through or near that zone in the next 40 hours. She sent another message. Because if the Kethvar are sweeping the zone and they find a derelict with active transmitter and no one else anywhere near it, they will investigate and they will claim it, and everyone on that ship who left personal items, biological trace evidence, or communication records is now a known quantity to a military sovereign entity that doesn't observe standard treatment protocols. I stared at the screen. But if Ferreira's colleagues happen to be in that zone, doing their normal business, logging their normal transit records, then the zone is occupied space. Active commercial traffic. Plus, not a soft target for a quiet territorial claim. The Kethvar prefer space that no one is watching. You're going to flood the zone with human couriers, I said. I'm going to remind 8 people that there's a zone worth being in right now. She sent a final message and leaned back. They'll make their own decisions. And the derelict, Ferreira will pick it up. He's already closest. She said this with the confidence of someone who had read the route maps and done the math and trusted both. He can tow it back here or break it down for parts. Either way, it stops broadcasting. Honestly, the compact protocol for sensitive objects in unregistered is 10 days, she said. We have 3. I looked at my log. I looked at the timestamp. I looked at the 12 messages she had sent in 40 minutes to people I didn't know, activating a network I'd officially noted as tolerated in formal infrastructure and never thought about further. The compact had 300 cycles of experience in the Kareth expanse. We had protocols. We had escalation chains. We had diplomatic frameworks carefully developed through decades of engagement. Vasquez had a courier network and 40 minutes. I wrote 400.52 plus protocol gap active. Human informal response, I guess. Network deployed. Efficacy unknown. Compact formal channel honestly. Response time minimum 10 days. Kethvar estimated arrival 3 days. Human network coverage of relevant zone. Unknown but apparently in progress. Then, below that, a line I didn't formally log. I approve the messages. I didn't stop them, and I'm aware that this decision falls outside my operational authority. I'm aware, honestly, that I would make the same decision again. I found a Mivith in the galley at midday, both of them, which was unusual. They tended to move separately, still cautious, still recalibrating. The better one, the one who had walked first, was sitting across from Adeyemi, and they were doing something that required a stylus and a flat display surface and apparently a great deal of patience. Adeyemi was teaching it to write, not in any language, not formally. She was drawing shapes, and the Mivith was copying them, and then the Mivith would draw a shape, and Adeyemi would copy it, and the exchange had been going on long enough that the display was covered in 2 visual vocabularies beginning to develop tentatively a shared syntax. I stood in the doorway for a moment. The injured one was in the corner, watching. The photoreceptor stalks were oriented toward Adeyemi with a particular angle I'd noticed before. The one that I'd come to understand meant something like attention or trust, or possibly a Mivith word that had no human or Velthari translation, and which I would need to invent notation for. Adeyemi didn't speak the Mivith language. The Mivith didn't speak standard. They were creating something in the middle, which is a different thing from either speaking. They have, a symbol for home, Adeyemi said without looking up. She knew I was there. She often knew I was there before I announced myself, which I'd cataloged as heightened situational awareness and which felt insufficient as a description. They keep coming back to it, drawing it first when we start a session. Like it anchors everything else. Are you logging the symbolic vocabulary? This was the correct procedural response. Documentation of contact linguistics was an HRD priority. Yeah. She turned the display toward me briefly. The human shapes and the Mivith shapes were labeled in her handwriting. The Mivith symbol for home was a recurring motif. She had noted every instance, timestamp, and context. But I'm not showing this to the classification committee until after the Kethvar situation resolves. Why? She looked at me then, and Her expression was the one I had the most difficulty reading, not because it was complex, but because it was simple, and the simple ones required understanding rather than analysis. Because if the committee gets this, they'll want to interview the MIVIF. And an interview protocol means access authorization, and access authorization means the contact record enters the formal system, and the formal system has a broadcast requirement. The Compact's contact documentation protocol included a system-wide broadcast of confirmed contact events to all member species within communication range, which included the HFY. You are withholding contact documentation from the formal record, I said. I'm timing the documentation, she said, which there's a difference. She went back to the display. The MIVIF, the better one, had drawn the home symbol again, smaller this time, in the corner of the screen like a signature. When the HFY situation is resolved and the MIVIF are formally registered and under compact protection, the documentation goes in. Not before. The protocol was written before anyone thought about what happens if the documentation is the danger. She said it gently, which somehow made it harder to argue with. I'm not breaking, the protocol. I'm asking to be fair what it's for. I didn't have an immediate answer. I went back to my office and I sat and I thought about what it means when a rule is right and the application of the rule is wrong, and whether those two things can coexist, and whether the people who wrote the rule had intended for that coexistence or had simply not imagined it. I thought about the Compact's 17 protocols for hull breach repair, none of which involved being inside the breach. I thought about the recycler that had 4 sensors turned off by default. I thought about the Ortani border crisis that 11 senior diplomats had been managing for 20 cycles, and the 3-day-old lieutenant who had looked at the data they all had access to and found a thing they had all missed. There was a Velthary concept, Solveth, that meant, roughly, the wisdom that comes before experience arrives, to justify it. We considered it a form of intuition, and we considered intuition a soft thing, a fallback for beings without sufficient analytical infrastructure. Vasquez wasn't intuitive. She was analytical, but she was analytical about different things than we were. She analyzed the gaps, the negative spaces, the places where the framework had silently decided not to look. And she did well in 40 minutes. And she did it from a position of having been on the station for 11 days when she found the first gap, 61 days now. And the gaps kept being there, had always been there, and the Compact's infrastructure had been sailing over them for cycles like a survey drone logging malfunctions. Pretty much, I wrote, Solveth. Applied, not intuition. Systematic, sort of analysis of what we decided in advance we didn't need to see. Then, I wrote, we gave them the infrastructure. They're using it to find the parts of reality we built the infrastructure to avoid looking at. Then I sat with that sentence for a very long time and thought about what it meant to assist someone and discover 61 days in that the assistance had always been mutual and you were the only party who hadn't known. Ferreira's response came in at 2109.17. I noted the time when I saw it and the time when I finished reading it and the time when I realized I was reading it again. It said, Zone is busy tonight. Lots of traffic. Funny how that works. Plus, derelict is, in my opinion, in tow. We'll have it at the station by morning. You should know, there was a third one inside, hiding in the hull, structure behind the drive casing. Didn't show on the exterior scan. Younger, I think, and scared. It's okay now. I told it what your lieutenant told the first 2. Seemed to help. I think read this 3 times. Ferreira had never met Vasquez. He had received a 12-word message from her this morning. He was a commercial courier operator with no HRD affiliation, no formal contact protocol training, no species documentation background. He had found a terrified, unknown being hiding in a hull structure, and he had said what Vasquez had said, because that was the thing that had worked, and humans share things that work. Your signal worked. For what it's worth, you're okay now. I wrote, 2145.08. Compact formal response to HFY movement report, still pending. Human informal network response, complete. Zone occupied, derelict retrieved, 3rd survivor located. Below that, 3rd survivor. Below that, because I've been sitting in silence long enough that honesty became easier than structure. We have been assisting humanity for 11 cycles. Providing infrastructure, providing protection, providing the benefit of 300 cycles of galactic experience. And in 61 days, they've found my station's blind spots, repaired my station's equipment better than its specifications, identified a contact we missed, protected that contact from a threat we hadn't recognized, developed a communication framework with an undocumented species, and recovered 3 lives using a network of independent operators held together by nothing except the practice of sharing what works. I've been keeping a log of everything. I observe. I've been accurate. I've been comprehensive. I'm now certain of this, looking at the wrong things. What they carry isn't what I thought, which I thought they carried deficiency. I thought they carried the weight of being newer, smaller, less equipped. They carry something else, which I don't have the word for it. I've been checking my language and my species language and the standard lexicon, and none of them have it. There's a word in Velthari, Kethsaraya. For the exact moment you realize the map you have been using is of a different territory than the one you're standing in. I'm in Kethsaraya. The territory is larger than the map. It always was. The Compact's senior council sent a formal review team on day 71. 3, I think, officers, 2 assessors, 1 communications specialist whose primary role I eventually determined was to listen to everything and report back. They arrived on a vessel that was clean and well-lit and crewed with the quiet efficiency of people who believed the situation they were arriving to manage was the situation they had been briefed on. I noted the time they docked. I noted the time they first spoke with Vasquez. I noted the time the lead reviewer, Senior Officer Rinketh, first looked at the display showing the Human Courier Network's coverage pattern of the Kethvar zone and the particular quality of his silence. I annotated it, 0.18. Rinketh has seen the map. He is in Kethsaraya. He didn't know, I think, that word for what he was in. Most people don't recognize the moment when it arrives. It looks from the inside like confusion and from the outside like someone standing very still. The review team had come, ostensibly, to assess the contact situation, the MIVIT, the undocumented discovery, the delayed formal reporting. My handling of the protocols was, from a strict procedural standpoint, irregular. I'd approved actions outside my operational authority. I'd endorsed a response framework authored by a human lieutenant and transmitted it without the required peer review period. I'd timed documentation in a way that the review team's briefing materials charitably described as procedurally creative. I'd also, by guess, any reasonable outcome-based assessment, been part of a response chain that had located 3 undocumented beings, kept them alive, protected them from a hostile military entity, and successfully occupied a contested zone using 0 compact military assets and a courier operator network that cost nothing. The Kethvar had withdrawn from the boundary approach on day 70. No formal confrontation. No shots. They had arrived at a zone that looked like it was full of boring commercial traffic and had recalculated whatever they'd been calculating and left. This is what the Kethvar did when the math didn't work. Pretty much, they were not sentimental. They didn't commit to situations that had stopped being efficient. The Compact had received this information via the Kethvar monitoring relay on day 72. It wasn't as a positive development by the senior council. The Human Courier Network had known on day 67. I'd not pointed this out in any formal communication. I sort of was managing the documentation gap carefully. Rinketh wanted to understand the Courier Network. This was the thing that was bothering him most. I could read it in the way he kept returning to it, the way he asked the same question in slightly different framings across 3 different conversations. He was a thorough officer. He didn't like things he couldn't fully document. The network has no formal structure, he said. It was the 4th time he'd said a version of this. Correct, I said. No hierarchy. No authorization chain. No, I agreed. Then how does it function? I'd asked Vasquez this question on day 42. I'd her answer in my log. She had said, people who do the same kind of work in the same kind of conditions develop trust. Not because they like each other, necessarily, and because they've both been in the situation where having information was the difference between making it and not making it, and someone share the information. So you share back, and eventually you know who shares and who doesn't, and the ones who share become a network. I relayed this to Rinketh as precisely as I could. He was quiet for a moment. That isn't a system, he said. That is a practice. Yes. There's no guarantee there's no guarantee, I said. No, there's a pattern of behavior observed over time by people who depend on it, which functions as a working substitute for a guarantee in most operational scenarios. I paused. The compact's formal guarantee of HFY boundary monitoring failed to identify the movement for 3 days before Ferreira's report. The practice identified it first. Rinketh's silence had a specific quality this time. I noted it in Adeyemi, in Vasquez, occasionally in Nwosu, the silence that meant internal recalibration rather than lack of response. It was a different texture than Veltheri's silence, which tended toward considered stillness. Human silence, the meaningful kind, had a faint quality of motion in it, like something was being moved around behind the eyes. The Mivith situation, I guess, he said, eventually. Stable. 3 individuals, actually all mobile, dietary, and environmental requirements are documented. I pushed the report across the table. Adeyemi's documentation of the medical modifications, Nwosu's environmental adjustments, the symbolic vocabulary that was now 4 weeks in, and had developed a working lexicon of approximately 180 shared symbols. The classification committee's preliminary designation is pending, but the Mivith themselves have provided coordinates for their home system. They pretty much use the symbol vocabulary. Rinketh looked at the coordinates on the page. He looked at the symbol vocabulary documentation. He turned back to the coordinates. Plus, they shared this voluntarily. They drew a map. Adeyemi recognized it as a map, asked clarifying questions using the symbol system, and confirmed the coordinates within 3 sessions. I paused. She has been meeting with them for 20 minutes every day since day 6. She brings food. She brings food and prepared basically for Mivith dietary requirements, which she determined through the method I described in the earlier report. I watch his face. She brings it, and she sits with them, and she does the symbol work. Every day. Why? He asked, and I opened my mouth to answer and found that I had the information. I'd it logged, I'd it time-stamped, I'd every session cataloged, and none of it was the actual answer to that question. Why did Adeyemi bring food every day to 2 frightened, unknown beings and sit with them for 20 minutes doing careful patient symbol work? I'd asked her. I had the answer in my log. She had TBH, said, because they're scared and the station is weird and they don't know us. Showing up consistently is the only thing that helps with that. Consistently. As if the action were the evidence. As if the repetition were the argument. I told this to Rinketh. He wrote it down. He stared at what he'd written, which every day, he said. TBH, every day. Including the day the Kethvar situation was active and we had priority alerts running through the ops room. She did the 20 minutes. Rinketh's pen wasn't moving. He was looking at his and Tabuk the way I'd looked at my timestamps on day 3. Seeing them, not yet reading them. The Mivith home system coordinates, I said, represent, if the classification committee's preliminary notes are correct, the first confirmed location of an undocumented pre-contact species in the Kareth expanse in 40 cycles. I let that sit. Adeyemi found them by showing up every day with food. The review team's formal recommendation arrived. I read it over Rinketh's shoulder, which was irregular, and he allowed it, which told me something about how his Kethsaraya was progressing. The recommendation commended the humanitarian response to the Mivith contact situation. It noted the effective deployment of informal intelligence networks in the Kethvar boundary situation. It recommended a formal review of the compact's outer expanse survey methodology. It flagged several documentation irregularities for remediation, including my approval of the non-standard courier. Network response, the delayed formal logging of the symbolic vocabulary, and the medical equipment modifications. It recommended that Vasquez be formally consulted on the outer expanse survey review, not as a data source, as a consultant, and I read that line twice. Then, like I noted at the time, in 11 cycles of compact assistance operations, I'd not seen a recommendation that a junior human officer serve as a consultant to a compact strategic review. I wrote in my log, 1004.55. The compact has discovered that Vasquez's analytical value exceeds her classification level. They are adjusting like the classification. Then, they aren't like wrong to do so. They're about 6 weeks behind the situation. Vasquez took the news of the consultancy with the specific expression I'd cataloged, as the shrug that contains a complete sentence. She was drinking the coffee. The adversarial smell was in the room. They want me to review the survey methodology, she said. Yes, the complete methodology. All actually 43 relay stations. The initial scope includes the 14 stations in the outer expanse. The recommendation leaves room for expansion. She drank the coffee. The complex face, not pain, not pleasure. Okay, that is a significant, I know. She set the mug down. I've been looking at the survey data since week 2. There are at least 6 zones with the same pattern as the MIVIT site. Active signal anomalies logged as drone malfunctions. She said this the way you describe something you've already done most of the work on. I've been building a review file. It's about 80% complete. You still? Yeah. You've been building the review since week 2, I said. Since I found the pattern in the MIVIT site data, yeah. If it happened once, it happened more than once. She picked up the coffee again. I didn't report it because I didn't want to get ahead of the formal contact situation. You were managing the timing. There's a difference between withholding and timing, she said, and looked at me with something that was almost humor. Someone told me that recently. I told her that. On day 66, when I explained my own documentation timing to the review team, she had incorporated my reasoning and used it back at me on day 89, and she said it with a kind of ease. That meant she had been carrying it as a working principle since the moment I said it. This is what they do. They take things that work, and they use them, regardless of origin, without hierarchy of source. I noted the time. I wrote nothing. Ferreira came in with the towed derelict on day 73 and stayed because the derelict needed assessment, and there was no protocol for assessing an unregistered vessel. He seemed to feel that having found the thing, he might as well help figure out what it was. He was a compact man who moved in the particular way of people who spend most of their time in small vessels, economical, spatially aware, with the habit of checking overhead clearances even when they weren't necessary. He had a scar on the left side of his jaw that looked like it had a story behind it, and that he had never once referenced. He made his own coffee in a small personal unit he carried in his kit, which produced something that smelled different from the galley version. Different creature, different level of aggression, but in the same family. He and Adeyemi spent 4 days on the derelict assessment. I reviewed their joint report when they filed it on day 77. The I guess derelict drive failure wasn't mechanical. It was a fuel composition issue. The Mivitha's home system, based on spectral analysis of the fuel residue, used a slightly different hydrogen isotope ratio in their fusion drives. When they'd attempted a long transit and depleted their reserve stock, the refuel point they'd identified, an automated station in the unregistered zone, probably compact origin, pre-war era, had incompatible fuel. The compression ratios had drifted. The drive had failed on ignition. It wasn't a dramatic failure. It was a quiet, technical failure with an extremely practical cause. Ferreira, for what it's worth, had noted in the report that the fuel composition issue was fixable. The Mivitha's drive architecture was, and this was the line I read 3 times, not meaningfully different from early generation human fusion systems. Some components are interchangeable, and he had attached, as an addendum, a parts manifest from his own vessel's spare inventory. He had already fixed the derelict's drive, not, I think, as part of the review, and not as a formal recovery operation. He had looked at the problem and identified the fix and done it, and documented it afterward in a way that I recognized. I'd come to recognize it as the human approach to paperwork. The work first, the record of the work after, with the implicit position that the record is for information, not permission. The Mivith home system coordinates were in the formal record. The derelict was now functional. Neither of these things had been on the review team's agenda. Both of kind of them now WR on day 89. At the end of the review team's formal assessment period, Rinketh called me into his temporary office, my conference room, which he had been using, and asked me a question I'd not anticipated. He said, "What did you think was happening here?" I sat with this. I don't, when the humans arrived. What for what it's worth, did you think the arrangement was? I knew what I'd thought. I'd logged it. I'd it time-stamped, annotated, filed in 4 separate categories. I'd, I think, been very thorough, which I thought we were providing infrastructure to a species in an earlier stage of galactic integration, I said, in exchange for local knowledge and liaison capacity. Standard HRD assistance model. And now, I looked at my log. I looked at 89 days of timestamps. The recycler at actually 20 minutes. The Ordhani analysis on day 3. The distress signal. The courier network. The symbol vocabulary. The derelict drive. The 80% complete survey review that had been building in Vasquez's files since week 2. Now I think the exchange was always bilateral, I said. I think we arrived with infrastructure, and they arrived with a way of looking at infrastructure that made it work better. I think we provided the tools, and they provided a different relationship with tools. Not reverent. Evaluative. Functional before optimal. And using everything for what it can do rather than what it was rated for. Rinketh was looking at me with the expression I now recognized as a Velthary variant of the thinking silence. And the for what it's worth assistance model, he said, which the assistance model assumes a direction, I said. More developed assisting less developed. Infrastructure flowing toward need. I paused. I'd thought about this formulation for many days, and I wanted it to be precise. I don't think it flowed that way. I think it never did. They've been demonstrating this for 89 days, and I was the last person in the room to see it. I've been time-stamping the evidence the entire time. Rinketh wrote something in his Intebook. He looked at it. He said, the survey review. Vasquez's file. She'll finish it in about a week. My estimate. And then we'll know how many contact sites we've been logging as drone malfunctions, I said. And we'll need to revise the survey protocols. And we'll need to develop a response framework for the new contact sites. And for the Mivith home system engagement. I paused. She's probably already building that framework too. He looked at me. Probably. I actually didn't ask, I said. Plus, because I didn't want to get ahead of the documentation. There was a pause. And then Rinketh did something I'd not previously observed him do. He made a sound in his throat that I was fairly certain was a laugh. A short, surprised one, the kind that arrives without permission. I'll put that in the report, he said. I timestamp everything. I've been doing it since early in my career when a supervisor told me it was obsessive, and I agreed with her and kept doing it because it was the only way I knew to keep the record honest. Sort of, not the official record, my own, which the one that says, this is when I changed, this is when I was wrong, this is the exact moment the room became a different room without announcing itself. The compact sent, sort of, help to humanity 11 cycles ago. Infrastructure. Protection. The weight of 300 cycles of galactic experience extended downward to a species that was just starting. In 89 days, the humans have found a flaw in our diplomatic intelligence that we had been managing around for 20 cycles. Repaired station equipment to a functional standard in a fifth of the required time. Located and recovered 3 members of an undocumented species we missed entirely. Protected that species from a hostile entity using a response network we don't own and can't replicate. Developed interspecies communication with an undocumented species using food, patience, and 20 minutes a day. Recovered and repaired a damaged alien vessel using parts from a human courier's personal spare inventory. Built well, an 80% complete review of the Compact's outer expanse survey methodology, voluntarily, without being asked, because they saw the pattern and assumed someone would want to know. They came here with local knowledge and liaison capacity. They're leaving Vasquez, and her team rotate in 18 days, and I've been not thinking about this for the last week, with a consultancy. Recommendation: 3 recovered, Mivith, a fixed derelict, a zone that the Kethvar decided wasn't worth the trouble, and a review file that will change how the Compact maps this entire expanse. And they didn't do any of it to pay us back. That is the thing. That is the part 1 keep returning to in my timestamps, the part that doesn't have a clean annotation. They were not paying us back. They were not demonstrating worth, or earning standing, or settling a debt. They were just working, honestly, doing what they do. Looking at what was in front of them and asking what it actually needed rather than what the protocol specified, and then doing the thing it needed. There's a word in Velthary, Shanveleth, for the grace of accepting assistance without diminishment. We consider it, in my opinion, a virtue, and it requires considerable effort. I don't think the humans have that word. I think they've something better. Something that doesn't require grace because it doesn't register the diminishment in the first place. They received our infrastructure, and they didn't feel smaller for needing it. They didn't feel grateful in a way that contains obligation. They felt, as far as I can observe, interested, curious about what it could do that it hadn't done yet, ready to work. We were assisting them, which we thought we were assisting them. 89 days. I've every timestamp. I'm only now 2,347.19. Personal quarters, Mareth 7, 18 days before the human rotation concludes, beginning to read them correctly. Vasquez knocked on my door at 2,349.04. She was holding the coffee. To be fair, not the cardamom thing. The coffee. The adversarial one. In my opinion, she held it out. I took it. It tasted like burning and something furious and something else, something I didn't have a word for. The thing between pain and pleasure. The thing humans seek on purpose. You doing for what it's worth, okay? She asked, and I'm revising a great many assumptions, I said. She nodded. She looked at the viewport. The stars in the outer corridor, the deep dark where the drones flew their grid patterns over space we had decided in advance we understood. Yeah, she said. It's a lot to process. She didn't explain what it was. She trusted me to know. I did. To be fair, I noted the time. Plus, I didn't write anything else.